All right, so we are in the book of Exodus. As a matter of fact, we are closing out the book of Exodus today. We said that we were going to do up to chapter 15. We are going to cross the water today, so to speak, on dry land. And so this is sort of our closing sermon in this series that we've done. What we're going to do then, after the Tees and Speak, the week after that, I'll be doing sort of a one-off sermon about how awesome fathers are and how important they are to all of society. Anyway, and then we'll be going in the book of James for the summer. And then after the book of James, in the fall, we will be going into the Sermon on the Mount. And we'll be digging into the Sermon on the Mount right up through till Christmas. And then in the practice, we're going to be working with the Beatitudes. So we got a fun-packed rest of the year of sermons and learning for us to do as a congregation. But today, our goal is to wrap up the book of Exodus. And so I want to remind you of a few things from the book of Exodus that you might have forgotten in this packed full sermon. It was all rooted, actually, in the book of Genesis. And we talked about the Pentateuch, and we talked about how the book of Genesis, at the beginning, how the book of Exodus assumes that you have already read the book of Genesis. And so it takes us all the way back to Genesis chapter 12 with a promise that God made to a guy named, at this point, Abram, who would later be named Abraham. And this is what it says in Genesis chapter 12. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you," here's the promise, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Exodus is a movement of the beginning of this promise to be fulfilled. And I remind you, too, that one of the premise of understanding Exodus is these two very simple things. That God is working on a good plan. So he's got a plan on how to fulfill this promise that he's made to Abraham. But at this point in history, before the Exodus, God had been absent. His presence was no longer with the people. We see him interacting with certain people, but not with the broad nation of Israel. And so God's presence is absent, but this promise still remains. And so the big question is God a God that fulfills his promises? And Exodus is the launching pad for that God is working on a good plan, that he hasn't forgot that plan, but he's working on a good plan. But how many know that that good plan doesn't always look like we think it should? So I said God's plan is built on his promises, but it rarely plays out the way we think that it's going to. That's actually a really important theme when you're working with Scripture, period. As I've said in our Habakkuk series and in this series, that often when we're praying and when we're really pressing in and we're asking God to intervene in something, we have these preconceived ideas of what that something should look like, and we miss the blessing because we need it to be shaped like we assumed the blessing would be. And this is something that we see the Israelites continuously doing throughout the book of Exodus. And so just to remind you that Exodus is the beginning of the fulfillment of this promise. And as we know that this promise moves right through into the cross and into Jesus Christ and the salvation that is brought through the cross. So today we're going to work through a chunk of Scripture. I'm going to read through it fairly quickly and bring some commentary along the way. I will bless you with a shorter message today, since you've sat through a few doozies. But we do have air conditioning, so you'll be fine. Now, the passage today is the end of Israel's servitude to Egypt. Their 400 years serving Egypt is coming to an end. and the beginning of their servitude toward Yahweh, toward God, is now going to begin. Now that seems a little weird because we automatically as Christians assume that the Jews have always been serving Yahweh, but Egypt had a huge impact on the history of Israel at this point. 400 years in oppressive slavery, and so they had lost sight, so to speak, of the Hebraic God, of Yahweh. They had really adopted a lot of practices that were based on the Egyptian gods as opposed to the Hebrew God. So kind of like us, who have adopted worldly ways as opposed to Christ's ways, but then imprinted those worldly ways into the church, and we call them religion. It's the same kind of thing that has happened back then, except that we're not technically in the kind of slavery that Egypt was at that point. We're just slaves to seduction. Did you catch that? All right, that's important. So it's the end of Israel serving Egypt and the beginning of Israel now returning back to serving Yahweh. They're moving from a band of slaves to becoming a nation. So we're going to start at chapter 13, starting at verse 17. It says, "When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter." Right away, I absolutely love this story. God takes them the long way. Right away. Now, in our society, we know we like the shortest possible way. Instant gratification, right? That's the kind of society we are. Whatever the shortest path is, the fastest path is, that's the way. And we have apps that lead us in that direction, that help us to avoid traffic and all the pitfalls of commuting. Anybody that hasn't left Simcoe has no idea what I'm talking about. But someday you'll venture outside of this county. It's going to be okay. And you'll make it. It might take a while, though. You might run into traffic. You might run into bumps along the way. So it's interesting that right away, God leads them on the road through, away from Philistine country that was shorter. On the road through the Philistine country, that was instead of going the short way. For God said they will face war. They might change their minds and return to Egypt. So I'm going to take you on the long path, because the short path, I don't actually think you can handle. I think the minute you get any kind of pushback on the short path, you're just going to go running back to Egypt. Does this sound familiar at all? When we take the short path and then we can't handle the troubles that come along our way, and so we go running back to slavery in Egypt. It's beautiful. He takes them on the long path. I'm going to take you a way that doesn't make sense, because if you fall into facing war, if you get any kind of backlash, anything against you, you're just going to hightail it back to Egypt because you'd rather be in slavery, because to you that would become the easiest way. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. Now, I could just imagine, poor Moses in this. I'm going to step aside out of the text because the text doesn't tell us this, but as a leader, I probably understand what Moses would have felt like in this moment. Can you imagine? Moses, it's ding, an email. Moses, there's a shorter way. Moses, you seem to be leading us in the wrong. Moses, there's a no. And he's like, follow me, just come along, trust me. I'm following the will of God. God is guiding all. Yeah, we get that, Moses, but there is a shorter way. So I want you to get that sense in this story, right? We got to put ourselves into the story to understand it, of what was probably actually happening here. So he led them around toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went out of Egypt. Now listen to this. Ready for battle. Now the Hebrew text is interesting there, because it doesn't necessarily mean that they're ready to pick up arms and fight. First of all, what did they even have? Do you really think that Egypt gave them swords and spears and all of those kinds of things? Understand that Egypt thinks, that Pharaoh and the Egyptian leaders think, that the Israelites are leaving for 3 days. They're going on a long weekend vacation. Nothing in the text tells us that any of their requests had changed. Remember way back when Moses asked for the wrong thing? So they're not going to equip them for any kind of battle. So the text there in the Hebrew is a little ambiguous. What battle exactly are they assuming they're going to fight? Out of the context of just coming through the plagues as well. And then it says, an interesting verse, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath. And he said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place. That's interesting. There isn't anything super spiritual there, although some have tried to draw that out. But essentially, Joseph is a past forefather of the Israelites, and he's requesting that his bones go with him. But it's also interesting to note what Joseph's assumption is here. So Joseph knows nothing about the slavery. Joseph knows nothing about what is coming. When Joseph passed away, times were good for the Israelites. They were not in slavery. But he says, God will surely come to your aid. Making an assumption that in one way or another they will need aid. And then making an assumption that one way or another God will definitely come to their aid. So they swear an oath, they made a promise, and so they pack up the bones of Joseph, and off they go, carrying the bones with them to this place. The forefathers knew about the promise. They're automatically assuming that this promise will come to full fruition. After leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. You'll see this often, especially in the book of Exodus. This is the representation of the presence of God actually being with them. So in the Exodus story, that presence first begins with a burning bush, and then transitions into, as they're leaving Egypt, this cloud that is hovering over them and providing light, leading the way, the presence of God leading the Israelites out of slavery, out of Egypt. This imagery to them was extremely important, would have been extremely comforting, because this is the return of God's presence to his people. For 400 years, they've felt alone. They felt like God wasn't interacting. They felt like God had let them down and not given them the promise of being the great nation that they had given to their forefathers. And so this cloud leading them is important imagery to the Hebrew people. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-hathroth, between Migdol and and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea, directly opposed Baal-zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion." This is interesting, right? Hemmed in by the desert. Now listen, "And I will harden Pharaoh's heart," so bring out what's already there, "and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." So the Israelites did this. That's that theme throughout, that what's the point of all of this? So that they will know that I'm Lord, so that they will know that I am Yahweh, the God of everything. And we see this throughout the plagues, and we're seeing this again. Now, it's interesting because, why turn them back around and then make it that the Israelites seem like they're wandering in confusion? Why would he do this? The next verse will tell us. "When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled." Now, if you're reading this carefully, you right away stopped and went, "Huh? I'm confused." Because if we go up to verse 17, when Pharaoh let the people go. And now, down here at verse 5 in chapter 14, it says, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled. Doesn't that seem weird? Why does he have to be told when he was the one that let them go in the first place? It's the proof that he thought they were leaving for 3 days. He did not think that they were leaving permanently. And so it was reported to him that after these 3 days, that they aren't coming back, Pharaoh. So see, when you read the text carefully, you catch these things, but when you just breeze by it, you completely miss it. So listen to what happens. Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, what have we done? We have let the Israelites go and lost their services. Remember a while ago I was pushing what was the whole motive behind Pharaoh not wanting the people to go? They were losing all their laborers. Any farmers here? Yeah. Tom, if all your laborers walked out today and left, and you thought they were just going on a 3-day holiday, and now you find out that they actually just completely fled, right? And Evergreen folks, we don't like to labor, and so we're not coming to help. You got to do it all yourself. Pharaoh and his leaders, they don't want to do this all themselves. And so they changed their mind. They're like, whoa, wait a minute. This isn't what was promised. This isn't the deal that we had. You were supposed to leave for 3 days to go worship your God, to offer sacrifices to your God. You weren't supposed to leave completely. This is going to crash our economy in its entirety. We need to put a new party in power to fix all of this. They do put more parties in power, and guess what? It doesn't get fixed. Just saying. So he said they changed their minds and said, what have we done? We let the Israelites go and have lost their services. So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-hathroth, opposite Baal-zephon. What you got to see here is, put this in the context of what's just happened with the 10 plagues. What is Pharaoh doing? He's putting together his strongest, greatest, most powerful army and officers to go out to fight a God who's been kicking some serious butt with them for 10 plagues. But this hardened heart, this hardened heart that Pharaoh has, this need for prosperity in their economy to continue, is what drives him to push out and try to get these laborers to return. And so I'm going to go and I'm going to fight that God that I've been losing desperately against. And so do we really think, is it really not obvious to Pharaoh that he's about to lose? Like when we read this, do we not think that it would be obvious that he's about to just seriously have a problem? You would think that we would think that way. But aren't we notorious for getting our army together and saying, hey, I want this my way, and even though I've gone through this and I've gone through this and I've been told this and I've been taught this and I've been led this way, I'm still going to push against it. I'm still going to put myself in a situation that's not going to bode well. I want you to see in the book of Exodus and in the Israelites and in the Egyptians just how much things are the same, just different. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up. And there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. So up above it said, but I thought they overtook them already. All that means is they overtook them in the sense of they approached closely. Again, read carefully. They didn't like overtake them by war. They were approaching closely. And as Pharaoh approached the Israelites, they looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. Now, again, take a step back. Walk yourself through the 10 plagues. Why on earth are the Israelites terrified at this moment? What is God showing them? He's showing them that He is all-powerful, that He is the God of the universe, that He can overcome everything, that He's willing to protect them. Think of the last bunch of plagues where God protected the Israelites and only put the plague upon the Egyptians. This is very human of them, isn't it? Oh no, we see the same people that God's been kicking the butt of. We see them again coming and, we're going to lose, we're terrified, what do we do? And this is what they say. They said to Moses, was it because there was no graves in Egypt that you brought us into the desert to die? So they've completely lost hope again. What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Think about it. 400 years of deep oppression and slavery, and they're like, we need to go back. Slavery's better than dying out here in the wilderness. Like, was there not enough graves back there? We could have just been buried back there. Think about what's happening here, folks. You got to think about it in the context of these plagues and how this is led up. Look at what God showed them. That He is the most powerful God in the universe, that He's got their back, that if they just follow His presence, they'll be fine. But what's their reaction? We're doomed. What'd you do to us, Moses? Oh my goodness. I find it ironic. They said, didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Now, it's really interesting how Moses answers. On the surface, it doesn't look that interesting because we actually lose the interpretation in most of our English translations. Moses answered the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. Now, that passage is used a lot, but it was fun when I was studying it because when you get looking at the original text, when you read it in the English, it's sort of like Moses saying, it's okay, folks. We're going to be fine. God is going to protect you. It's all going to be good. Just the Lord will fight for you. You need to just be still. We should all go into a pose. Right? That's often how I see this verse quoted. The problem is in the Hebrew, the best way that this section of the text actually could be interpreted, and I think they probably don't do it because you would be offended because we get offended easy, is simply this. Moses turned to them and said, shut up! That's exactly how the Hebrews rendered. Be quiet, shut up, stop complaining. Enough, can't you see that God's going to protect you? That's the tone that's happening in the original text. So you see how we read it all like fluffy, and we're like, woo, God is awesome, this is great. Their leader just turned to them and said, shut up, stop, enough. Now we're all like, I can't believe he said shut up from the pulpit. Guess what? Shut up. Folks, you got to understand what's happening here. That shut up is really important. So you need to get your stick out of the mud and see what the text is saying here. How much do I need to prove to you, folks? This is what Moses is saying. That God is the most powerful God, that God is sovereign, that He's over all things and He's in all things, and that He will protect you, that He will guide you, that He will fulfill His promises. So when you read it with that tone, you start to see, wait a minute here. Something's happening. But when you read it with the fluffy tone, you're like, oh, that's nice. So I'm sorry to be crass, but folks, I need to do that to get the point across for you to understand that the Bible's awesome. Not boring. Not fluffy. God is sovereign. When you say those words, do you really honestly, if I was to let out what's in my head when I hear people claim the sovereignty of God but then live the way they live, I'm completely confused. Do we understand what God's sovereignty means? Do we understand in this story, which is giving us a picture of the salvation story, do we understand what this is bringing to us, what these plagues showed us? How many people, let's be honest, don't put up your hand, I won't center you out, but how many people, if they've ever even read the book of Exodus, even bothered to read the plagues? As they got booking along, they're like, oh, that was boring. Let's skip it. It's kind of like the genealogies, right? You can't grasp the context unless you see what he was doing in those plagues. And so I want you to catch this tone. Now, God actually also rebukes Moses. It said, then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Now, the text doesn't tell us this, but the assumption here is that Moses turns to the people, rebukes them, but then he begins to backpedal and cry out to God. I know that feeling, where the pushback is just too much, and so you end up going to God about something that he very clearly showed you shouldn't be backpedaling about. And so he says, why are you crying out to me? Like, come on. And listen, tell the Israelites to move on. God's pretty blunt there, isn't he? Why are you crying out to me? Have I not shown you enough? Is my presence not there with you, guiding you along the way? Tell the people, move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the waters so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. Now, you know that whole thing about how I didn't see it playing out the way I thought that it was playing out? How many people would be standing at the shore of Lake Erie, and if I turned around to you and said, folks, we're going to walk across to Erie, Pennsylvania for a day of shopping, and we're going to do it on dry ground. So Shirley, pick up your staff, spread that water, and let's go, folks. That's not how they're thinking, are they? They're at the shore of the sea, and they're like, we're trapped. We're trapped. This is the end. It's exactly what it says in the text above, right? We should have just stayed in Egypt. It's all over. We got exercise for no reason at all. He says, I'll harden the heart of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. And I'll gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army. So he's repeating himself, which means it's important. Through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. Then the angel of God, so there's other presence here, the angel of God who had been traveling in front of Israel's army. So again, I want you to see the imagery of the burning bush and the angel appearing to Moses. The angel of God is here. And he'd been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew, and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. That's protection. That's God placing his presence, placing his armies in between the Israelites and the armies of the Egyptians. You want to know why? Because he sent them all to bed. We read this and we think it's like bam, bam, bam. It's all just happening like this big saga. It says, throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. He sent them to bed. So I'm about to part the sea. I'm going to walk you across on dry ground, but let's all get some rest and relax. As the Israelites are like pushing down on them, and right there, we see this protection happen, and they all go to bed. Did you ever see that before? Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, so it's morning. And all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. Now, I have to be honest, I did look for that Bruce Almighty clip where he parts the tomato soup. But I couldn't, yeah. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving, and the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Okay, a very simple mind would say, why didn't they see this coming? Remember their motive. Remember why it keeps mentioning their hardened hearts. Folks, there's often times where destruction is coming your way because of decisions that you're making, but you very clearly think that's my path, that's the direction that I should go, because your heart is deceiving you. We can even find verses that will tell you that your heart's actually okay, that, you know, if you pluck verses and take them out of context, you can make the Bible say just about anything. So remember what is going on here. This isn't God making Pharaoh ridiculously stupid, hardening his heart so that he just doesn't get it, he's not able to, because that would be him imposing his will, which then means we have no free will. He's not imposing his will upon Pharaoh, he's exposing what's already in his heart, his motive. And so he doesn't see the big picture. He doesn't get it because he's got other things driving his heart. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back from the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept into the sea. The water flowing back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground and with a wall of water on the right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. Isn't that interesting? Just above, they're freaking out. We should go back to Egypt. The miracle happens, they're delivered, and the people are like, woohoo, look at our God. We're now going to serve our amazing God again. We're now going to trust Moses, our leader. If we actually look further on, what we see is a constant flip-flop of the people. Whenever there's trouble, whenever there's strife, whenever there's anything that's a little bit uncomfortable, it's like, oh, we should have just stayed in Egypt. Why? How? And then they get mad at Moses. And then God intervenes again, and then they're like, yeah, that's right. If you shape your faith that way, you are in trouble. That is so far outside of the attributes of God and knowing what God is actually like, you're in some serious trouble. If you pray, folks, that every time there's trouble, you go running to God, He fixes it, and then you go yay for 3 days, and then you forget about Him because you don't need Him anymore, you're in trouble. That's not faith. And that's what we see happening. So there's 4 main themes that we see throughout the book of Exodus and that I've taught you through. It's a theme of redemption. That God is redeeming His people. He's pulling them out of slavery. But then we see this theme of reconciliation. That there's this reconciliation, this fixing that needs to happen between God and His people. And we see the return of God's presence. We take that so much for granted because God is so present with us today. But trust me, folks, they feared losing God's presence more than anything in the world. And so the return of God's presence and that protection of that cloud is core to the Hebraic way of thinking about their God. And it's actually core to all of Christianity because God is open and present in and through all of us. And the big thing is God keeping His promise. It's a mess along the way. And I think the Bible's showing you that on purpose, that the Israelites are far from perfect, yet they're the chosen nation. But that as the story begins to progress, like I said last week, they're given glimpses of who God is. They've got His presence, but His presence is hovering up here. His presence through Christ and the cross is now living in us. Think about that. We sometimes have this view of God hovering up here, but yet Scripture says God's living in you when you profess Him as Lord and Savior. That the presence of God is with us always, that He's omnipresent. He's here right now. That's why it always drives me nuts when we say, come. He's already here. But you can ask Him to come, but He's already here. The Old Testament shows us all kinds of messiness, all kinds of struggles. Nothing in Christianity anywhere says that you need to be without spot or wrinkle in order to serve Jesus Christ. As a matter of fact, the only way that it says that you are without spot or wrinkle is through the cross of Jesus Christ. That our holiness is done through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, not through your actions. But we preach different things like that in the Christian church today, and we muddle it up and we make it like it's this God hovering in a cloud ready to smite us, rather than an all-loving God full of grace and mercy. And I wish I could respond like Moses did. What I want you to see, folks, is what the book of Exodus gave us. It's a beautiful view of the salvific process through the cross of Jesus Christ. Now, let me unpack that. Salvific, salvation. A perfect view of salvation. They're giving us a picture of the cross here. He's giving us an imagery of who we are, just like the Israelites, even just like the Egyptians. But yet, He's willing to walk through and protect us, to lead us out of slavery of sin. Not slavery in Egypt anymore, but slavery out of sin, because we're a slave to our sin. The Exodus story, folks, is the gospel. The good news. It's later communicated differently through Christ, but the Exodus story gives us images of the gospel message: deliverance, redemption, reconciliation. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. when you look at the values that surround it, when you look at what God is willing to do, that God's willing to stoop down for you, to take things upon himself through his Son, Jesus Christ. The big idea today is this. God continues to keep his promise to his people. Remember that, because he's made promises. He continues to keep his promises to his people. In Egypt, God delivered his people through mighty acts, signs, and wonders, yet the people struggled with disbelief. God continues to keep his promise through the loving grace of Jesus Christ, delivering his people from the slavery of sin, still offering grace for the same disbelief. Yet, this is the cool part, transforming us into the likeness of the Son. There's the new covenant piece. It starts in the Old Testament. After Exodus, as it transitioned, if I was going to continue teaching this, we would get into the book of Leviticus. And Leviticus is the process of God pushing them toward obedience through a legal system. But now what God does is pushes us through obedience, through transformation, through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ on the cross. And so he is still offering us grace, just like he's offering the Israelites grace here. This is where you need to see grace in the Old Testament because it's saturated with it. But he's still offering the same grace for the same disbelief because we still do the same things. Yet, he's transforming us into the likeness of the Son.